Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Elevate, a GE Healthcare educational webinar series. My name is Dr. Arlene Siriodica. I am the Clinical Education and Applications Manager for Life Care Solutions in ASEAN for GE Healthcare, and I will be your moderator this evening. Tonight, we are privileged to have an innovative medical educator and simulation enthusiast. He is an intensive care specialist as well as the clinical lead for medical education and simulation at St. George Hospital in New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. He finished his Doctor of Medicine degree and residency training in anesthesia from the Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research in Chandigarh, India. He holds a European diploma in intensive care medicine. He is a fellow of the College of Intensive Care Medicine. He is also a certified healthcare simulation educator. He is a faculty member of the Health Professional Educator Workshop run by Harvard Macy Institute, Boston, USA. He is also an instructor for mechanical ventilation, ALS instructor course, and advanced simulation. He also writes medical blogs and has podcasts on ICU pharmacology, Educators Podcast for budding and educators, as well as Meet the Expert podcast. He is currently pursuing his PhD on effects of emotional states on working memory resource depletion in healthcare professionals at the School of Education at the University of New South Wales. Joining us from Australia, let us all welcome Dr. Swapnil Pawar to give part two of the lecture on neuromuscular transmission monitoring, physiology, and clinical use. Over to you, Dr. Swapnil.
Thanks, Arlene. So good evening, everyone. So first of all, thanks to G for giving me this opportunity to present in today's webinar series. And obviously, I'm continuing as a part two of this series. So I'm aware that the physiology of the neuromuscular blockade has been covered previously. And the focus of this talk today is precisely to cover the usage of neuromuscular blockade in intensive care unit. And I'm more than happy to take questions at the end of the talk. Obviously, in this COVID era with webinars, it's very difficult to see or interact with the audience. So I have, as Arlene mentioned, that I have used the poll EV to interact with you during the talk. So make sure that you type that link in your browser and be ready because the questions will keep coming during the talk. So first of all, I want to say that the relationship between the intensivist and the neuromuscular blockade is pretty much like a love-hate relationship. So obviously, on one side, we love neuromuscular blockade agents, and we like to use them in various circumstances. But at the same time, we don't really like them because they come up with their own complications and their own set of challenges. And that's why it has been like we know the neuromuscular blockade agents since early 19th century, but and initially the trend was to use neuromuscular blockade pretty much in every single patient in the intensive care unit. But then obviously over the period of time, as we develop more understanding about the neuromuscular blockade agents, the usage of neuromuscular blockade agents in intensive care unit is slowly decreasing. So that's why I call it as a love-hate relationship. We can't really let them go, but at the same time, we don't like to use them often. And the key kind of messages that I want to deliver today out of this talk is first and foremost is intensive care is all about the balance. It's about the risk and benefit, and it applies to every single intervention, including neuromuscular blockade. So before you use neuromuscular blockade in ICU, we have to kind of consider risk and benefits, and then weigh the option. And then so that's my first take-home message. The second take-home message is every single patient in ICU is unique and it's different both biologically, physiologically, pathologically, and the way the patient reacts to the interventions. And this is very important because, and I will cover that during the talk, and I will explain why I say this. Even you might be working in Singapore, you might be working in Europe, you might be working in Australasia or any subcontinent, even though the patient population within that area might be similar, although every single patient who comes to ICU is physiologically quite unique. And that context is really important for this talk. So the overall, what I want to cover in this talk is first and foremost is why we use neuromuscular blockade, when we use neuromuscular blockade in intensive care, who or which agents we use in intensive care unit, for facilitating neuromuscular blockade. And then what's the actual evidence that we got on neuromuscular blockade? Also, I want to cover briefly about how do we monitor or how we're supposed to monitor the neuromuscular blockade adequacy. And then lastly, I want to cover where to go from here. So that's the kind of my brief overview of the talk. So let's begin with the why question. Now, obviously, we kind of, as I mentioned, the relationship between the intensivist and neuromuscular blockade is pretty much love-hate relationship. And that's why it's important to understand why do we really need them. And there is obviously the physiological rationale behind the use of neuromuscular blockade. The first one is obviously it helps in optimal relaxation of the vocal cords. So all those who work in intensive care unit or anesthesia, we know that in order to optimize the conditions for intubation, we need a vocal cord to be relaxed, and that's why we need neuromuscular blockade agents. Also, neuromuscular blockade agents help us to improve the chest wall compliance. And obviously that has implications in various pathologies, especially the severe respiratory failure. It also helps to decrease the oxygen consumption. It abolishes the patient ventilator dyssynchrony. It prevents shivering. And also neuromuscular blockade agents help us to decrease the intra-abdominal pressures and intracranial pressures. And that's the kind of main rationale why we like to use neuromuscular blockade agents in intensive care unit. And so obviously that itself kind of explains, so when we are going to use them in intensive care unit. And before I kind of dive into what are the kind of indications described in the literature, I really want to get some idea from the audience that where you like to use neuromuscular blockade agents in intensive care settings. So if you can type the link in your browser, and this question will be on your screen. So if you can either choose whether you want to use it in every single mechanically ventilated patients, at least for first 24 to 48 hours. Do you want to use it only in select group of patients? Or you say that you do not prefer to use them at all. So obviously the poll is open for you guys to interact. You guys getting the activity on the screen?
Dr. Swapnil, I am getting a different question on Pole EV. It's my practice of use of NMB in patient with ARDS.
Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. I'm not sure why that came up. But okay, I will probably come back to this one. Okay. Okay, that's fine. I'll probably go back to the next slide and then probably come back to this later on. So just to kind of cover the indications, and I hope most of you probably answered only in select subgroup of patients. The indications in ICU for neuromuscular blockade agents are usually first and foremost is emergent intubation or protecting the difficult airways. Now, intensive care patients are quite unique because first and foremost is they're usually hypoxic compared to patients that we normally see in operation theaters or ORs. quite unwell. They are hemodynamically unstable patients, and intubating patients in intensive care unit is often challenging. And often that's why we need to use neuromuscular blockade even more as a priority in intensive care unit. Having said that, the margin of error is quite small in intensive care unit, because if you give a neuromuscular blockade agent and if you can't secure the airway, obviously you might end up in situations such as cannot intubate and cannot ventilate, which is quite dangerous. And that's why when you use neuromuscular blockade agent in intensive care unit patients for intubation, you really need to be very cautious in your usage and in your selection of your agents. And we'll come back to which agents are appropriate in intensive care settings. The second important indication is sometimes protecting the difficult airway. And what I mean is here is sometimes we do see patients in the intensive care unit who come from operation room after securing the airway or after performing the tracheostomy. Say, for example, patients with Ludwig's angina comes with a nasal intubation. Patient with a very difficult upper airway comes with the elective or semi-elective tracheostomy performed by the ENT surgeons. And for first 12 to 24 hours, you really don't want to mess up with that airway, because that airway is really a precious airway. And if you lose that airway, obviously there is no alternatives available at that stage. And that's why sometimes we have to kind of continue neuromuscular blockade agents for first 12 to 24 hours in order to maintain that or protect that difficult airway. Now, the next indication is usually the severe respiratory failure, and that kind of includes ARDS and also status asthmaticus and massive hemoptysis. Now, the massive hemoptysis is also quite challenging because first of all, sometimes the patients do not have secured airway, so you need to secure the airway first and then kind of control the bleeding. ARDS and status asthmaticus has got different rationale behind using neuromuscular blockade agents, and the main idea is here to kind of facilitate mechanical ventilation, avoid barotrauma, and also make sure that we are optimizing the gas exchange. Also sometimes in intensive care unit we use neuromuscular blockade agents for short procedures, such as performing the bronchoscopy again in hypoxic patients. We need them to be calm, quiet, not coughing while we are performing the bronchoscopy. Sometimes we do perform GI endoscopies in intensive care unit, and so while performing the specialized intervention radiology procedures, which can vary from either putting IR guided drainage of collections in abdomen or embolectomy for pulmonary embolism. So the indications for IR procedures can be varied, but during those procedures, again, you kind of want patients to be still and not moving. Other kind of major indication in intensive care unit is therapeutic hypothermia following cardiac arrest. And the main reason is because the patient who come after out of hospital cardiac arrest, they usually get targeted temperature management, not necessarily hypothermia management, but they usually get targeted temperature management. And with that, usually patients start shivering, that increases the oxygen consumption. And obviously you don't want that to happen. And that's why sometimes we have to use neuromuscular blockade agent in order to prevent shivering and increase oxygen consumption. The next indication is also it's quite common in intensive care unit, which is the raised ICP, and usually can be seen in the setting of severe traumatic brain injury, stroke, subarachnoid hemorrhage, or intracranial bleeding. And usually, as Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines say, we usually use a tiered approach. So we obviously neuromuscular blockade agent is not the first line of treatment for these patients, but when the ICP is not managed or not adequately controlled with adequate analgesia and sedation, the neuromuscular blockade agent is usually the next go-to approach. Moving from intracranial pathologies to intra-abdominal pathologies, sometimes we do get abdominal catastrophes in ICU, and in order to control the intra-abdominal pressures, neuromuscular blockade agents are usually considered. Because sometimes going to operation theater it might not be the option. So The next is about the severe hemodynamic instability, which usually requiring the mechanical support such as ECMO or IBP. And again, in this kind of settings, patients are so unstable. Usually, moving or coughing can actually precipitously drop the blood pressure, and again, need paralysis for short duration. And the other indications are usually in tetanus or neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Sometimes, again, with the increase in muscle activity, you kind of need to use neuromuscular blockade agents. So these are the kind of very broad brush of indications of usage of neuromuscular blockade in intensive care unit. Um, so that kind of covers the when we use them in intensive care unit. The next part component is which agents do we use in intensive care unit, and or who are the kind of main players who are available for us in order to use in intensive care unit. And I hope this poll everywhere works now. If you can see this question on your poll everywhere. Kinetics and pharmacodynamics of neuromuscular blockade agent in intensive care unit. So I'm not going to kind of teach you guys kind of completely new things here, but I just wanted to highlight key facts about some of the agents. So first and foremost is about the succinylcholine. Now succinylcholine is a very well-known agent. Everybody knows it's a depolarizing muscle relaxant. Now, obviously, we cannot use as an infusion. So that's just a pharmacokinetic fact that succinylcholine cannot be used as a infusion. But the utility of the succinylcholine is quite high, especially in the setting of emergent intubation in intensive care unit. As I was mentioning before, the onset of action is very quick, the duration of action is very small, and as I said, the patients can be really, really tricky in intensive care unit with the unanticipated difficult airway, or they can be very hypoxic. So if you want to end up in situation where you cannot intubate, cannot ventilate, at least you want to use some agent which is very ultra short acting, and that's why succinylcholine is probably handy drug. So in terms of the second agent that we normally kind of consider for intubation is usually rocuronium, which has got a kind of similar profile to succinylcholine. The difference is though the duration of action is quite prolonged compared to succinylcholine. And obviously now at least we got a antidote or the reversal agent for rocuronium, that is Sugamadex. But before arrival of Sugamadex, the rocuronium was really challenging. The other problem with the rocuronium in use in intensive care for the emergency intubations is sometimes the patients can develop severe allergies or anaphylactic reactions to rocuronium. And in that kind of situation, you really don't want any additional complication happening to your patient when they're already hypoxic, hemodynamically unstable. And if there's an anaphylaxis to rocuronium, then it can be very challenging to manage as well. So rocuronium is usually the less preferred drug compared to succinylcholine. But obviously, if the patient is hyperkalemic, patient comes with the burns, and you do not have any other choice, the rocuronium can be considered as a alternative agents. So usually what we do here in Australia is the first choice as such is still kind of succinylcholine. But if the patient doesn't have any kind of anticipated difficult airway, or patient seems to be very straightforward intubation, then we go with rocuronium. So there are kind of couple of important facts about succinylcholine and rocuronium. Now, when you look at the duration, obviously the pancuronium has got a longest duration, and that itself has a problem because the more long-acting agents you use in the intensive care unit, they have the higher evidence of critical illness polyneuromyopathy, as indicated in the the bottom column. And so you don't want to use the agent which will obviously increase the risk of critical illness weakness. That means patient is going to stay in intensive care for a long period of time. They're not going to come off the ventilator, and you really don't want agents that are hanging in the body for longer period of time. So pancuronium is usually less favored. Other problem with the pancuronium, it can really give rise to tachycardia. So that's another problem. Now, so kind of what is the ideal agent or choice of agent for usage in intensive care unit as the infusion? So obviously succinylcholine is out. Then left are obviously your amino steroid compounds, and then benzyl isoquinoline compounds. Now, amongst all those things, the two agents which kind of meet the most of the intensive care requirements are cis-atracurium and atracurium. The reason being, vecuronium has again got the elimination of vecuronium still depend on renal and hepatic clearance. Now, the problem in intensive care unit is most of the patients do have varied degrees of either renal impairment or the hepatic impairment. And that means, again, the clearance will be slow and vecuronium is going to hang around in the body for longer period of time. Also, vecuronium has got an active metabolite, which has also kind of some potency in terms of neuromuscular blockade. And again, that means the action of vecuronium will be prolonged if you use it as an infusion. So between atracurium and cis-atracurium, obviously the cis-atracurium is much better profile than atracurium, and it has obviously got a Hofmann elimination. So that means it's organ independent elimination, so it does not depend upon liver or renal clearance, and also it does not have any toxic metabolite, so it does not have that landinosine, which has got a CNS toxicity. So by default, cis-atracurium becomes the kind of choice or the best possible agent that we can use as an infusion in intensive care unit. And that's been our practice in Australian ICUs, where we prefer to use cis-atracurium infusion in patients who require neuromuscular blockade agents. Obviously, I am aware that obviously some of the developing countries where cis-atracurium costs can be a major issue. And in that case, obviously the choice will be probably the vecuronium. But again, whenever you use any agent, be mindful of the side effects or the complication or the pharmacological profile of that agent, so that you can make that choice correctly. So that's the kind of brief about which agents are available and what are the kind of their profiles, and which one you should be using based on availability in your region. Now, the next question kind of comes is, okay, if we kind of commence someone on a neuromuscular blockade infusion, what should we do? How we should monitor whether they have achieved adequate depth of neuromuscular blockade or not? And that's really a challenging question. I hope or wish the answer would have been very simple, because we do have again, I think this might not work. So we do have some of the neuromuscular kind of blockade monitors available, and the very commonly used ones are the Trainer 4 monitors, which are available across. Most of the ORs use it. Most of the ICU intensive care units in Australia and New Zealand, we use this monitor very commonly, where basically you apply the 2 electrodes on the ulnar nerve, stimulate every kind of 5 seconds, and give like 4 stimuli, and then you kind of find the height between the fourth count and the first count. And then based on the TOF count, you kind of gauge what is the adequacy of the neuromuscular blockade. Now, the way to kind of gauge the depth of neuromuscular blockade, there are kind of described as different levels, of level 1 to level 5, and level 5 being the complete neuromuscular blockade. Now, if you notice, there's another monitor that you can use is the post-tetanic count compared to TOF, which is a Trainer 4. Obviously, the post-tetanic count is probably the better than the TOF count. Having said that, we kind of normally use TOF in ICU because we really don't want a complete neuromuscular blockade in ICU patients. We're happy with a deep level of neuromuscular blockade, which is equal to TOF count of 0. And obviously there are based on usually like to keep the Trainer 4 or TOF count anywhere between 0 to 2. We really don't want TOF of 4, but at the same time we don't want 0 all the time in some of the patients. So usually 0 to 2 is the kind of accepted neuromuscular blockade. And really it kind of boils down to what is the purpose and why you are using the neuromuscular blockade in intensive care unit. And that obviously helps you to kind of choose what TOF count you are aiming at. Because sometimes you really need deep level of neuromuscular blockade or paralysis, but sometimes you do not need deep, or you're happy with the moderate level of paralysis. And I think that's where your clinical judgment is very important. Now, what are the kind of drawbacks of neuromuscular blockade monitoring? So first and foremost is the monitoring site. So it can be either you can use the most commonly adductor pollicis that is on your hand, but it's probably not the most accurate in terms of your TOF count. And usually the recommended is it can usually orbicular oculi is usually the better. But obviously monitoring that in intensive care unit can be challenging. And the second factor can be the patient factors, which includes the temperature. So obviously, if patient are the peripheries are extremely cold, or if they are if they got high grade temperatures or fever, then neuromuscular blockade monitoring will not show the accurate results. Also, the patients are having a lot of edema or skin resistance due to thick skin or any skin lesions. The neuromuscular blockade will not be accurate, because the ulnar nerve is again a very superficial nerve, and any increase in the skin resistance over the ulnar nerve will affect the TOF count. The third important thing is unfamiliarity with the equipment, because unless you know what you're doing with the equipment, it's interpreting the results is going to be very challenging. And a lot of time we see in ICU is a lot of staff members are not actually familiarized with the technique of use. If you apply the electrodes wrongly, if you don't apply exactly on the locations they're supposed to be, obviously you're not going to get accurate result with your neuromuscular blockade monitoring. The fourth problem is usually that there is a lot of electric interference in intensive care unit, and that comes with the nature of the ICU. So obviously, with a lot of monitors, and they can actually interfere with neuromuscular blockade. And most of the ICUs sometimes they do not have actually this surprisingly neuromuscular TOF monitor, and if you don't have equipment, you can't really monitor. And when you look at the actual evidence available on neuromuscular blockade monitoring use in patients who actually are receiving neuromuscular blockade agents, it's actually a very weak recommendation, and it's based on the very low quality evidence, which is mainly in terms of the retrospective studies or mainly the observational studies. And it kind of makes it really challenging to kind of enforce or make it mandatory to use a TOF monitor in patients in ICU. Now, if you look at the most of the trials, the large randomized controlled trials done in intensive care unit, where they compared the use of neuromuscular blockade agents versus the controls, those all big trials did not use neuromuscular blockade monitoring in ICU, which is quite which sometimes makes it very hard to interpret the evidence available on neuromuscular blockade agents. And I'll cover what's my own recommendation on neuromuscular blockade monitoring at the end. But these are just the kind of pitfalls that you need to be aware when you're using them in your settings. So what's the evidence, and where is the kind of evidence lies at the moment? So there are kind of lot of not a lot of robust evidence available, unfortunately, on this topic. But what we got is the guidelines which are published by Society of Critical Care Medicine in Critical Care Medicine to 2016. Now, this is the third iteration of these guidelines, and those guidelines kind of came initially in 1995, the second in 2002, and then the third version came out in 2016. There is also a review which is published in 2020 around in intensive care medicine, and then there's another review which is published in CHEST in 2017. So these are the kind of there are guidelines and reviews which are available on this topic, which kind of forms the good foundation of this evidence. But at the end of the day, if you look at the guidelines, by the Critical Care Society of Critical Care Medicine, it's kind of interesting for me, because the only one recommendation is actually the strong recommendation, and that too about the scheduled eye care with lubrication and eyelid closure. apart from that, all recommendations are actually weak recommendations. And in fact, there are certain recommendations that they came up as a good practice based on expert opinion, because there's not enough evidence to kind of support those recommendations. So it kind of fascinating to me that despite neuromuscular blockade agents have been around for almost a century, we still do not have any kind of strong recommendations. The most of them are still weak recommendations, and that itself shows that unfortunately, even in this modern era, we do not have a good quality evidence on this topic. And we will cover this recommendation in depth one by one. But realistically, the problem with all the guidelines or the reviews, systematic reviews and meta-analysis is the problem is once you start putting the garbage in, what you get is probably the garbage out. And if the quality of the evidence which is going into guidelines is not going to be robust or is strong, unfortunately, we are not going to get a strong recommendations, because there's not enough good quality research available on this topic. And that's probably one of the biggest concern around neuromuscular blockade in ICU. And that kind of brings back to this whole first premise that I was mentioning about, that every patient in ICU is unique. And similarly, every single pathology that we see in intensive care unit is unique. And that's why generalizing the findings of evidence as, okay, we should use neuromuscular blockade in ICU versus we should consider using neuromuscular blockade in particular subgroup of patient is quite different. And that's why when you kind of look at the evidence, you really need to separate these subgroups, separate these different patients or cohorts of the patient, and then interpret the evidence. And sometimes the evidence is very, very clear that what you should be doing, but sometimes the evidence is not so clear. And that means then you have to kind of either interpret the evidence very carefully and choose what you want to do in that particular clinical context. So a lot of things come down to how you look at the evidence. And the first cohort of patient that I really want to talk about in depth is ARDS. Because the key kind of controversy about use of neuromuscular blockade agent in ARDS has come to the surface after some of the recent publication of very landmark randomized controlled trial. Now, ARDS itself there's a lot of controversy itself around ARDS now, whether we should use this terminology or not. This is really not a kind of pathology. It's a syndrome. It's a constellation of different pathologies, and we are trying to use this one size fits all approach to ARDS with respect to any intervention is not going to work. And that's kind of true with regards to neuromuscular blockade agents. I think this is the question that you probably you answered a while ago, because I think I was trying to see the answers. So if you can just answer this. So what I can see answers on my screen here on this. If you're not answered before, you can still answer this question, I guess. Thank you. Okay, so just to recap the results of this poll, basically 30% people saying that they go with the plateau pressure in terms of selecting or using the neuromuscular blockade agents in ARDS. 18% go by PF ratio, plateau pressure, driving pressure, and chest X-ray findings. And maybe 17% people are saying they do not use neuromuscular blockade in ARDS patients. And that kind of that split itself explains the confusion about this topic. And again, it's not, it's nothing. There is no right or wrong answer here. It just explains that the evidence out there is not very clear at the moment for us to kind of make any particular call. And that's why I said the ARDS is a very complex topic. It's not that easy, and interpreting the evidence is really, really challenging. So thanks for all those who participated in this poll. It's quite fascinating for me. So what actually the guidelines say, really? So the guideline recommendation is the guidelines say that we suggest that the neuromuscular blockade agent administered by continuous IV infusion early in the course of ARDS for patients with PF ratio less than 150. So basically, guidelines actually endorse using but be mindful that obviously these guidelines were published in 2016 and we are talking in 2021. Having said that, the interesting finding to note is that this was a weak recommendation and the quality of evidence was only moderate. So this was not based on any kind of strong quality of evidence, and even the recommendation is very weak. But obviously, as the experts, they feel that we should probably use for early in the course. Now, if you look at this recommendation, actually, they're based on 3 multi-center randomized controlled trials, which equals to total 431 patients only. So obviously, at least on this topic, there are randomized controlled trials available, and the number is around 431, which is not a huge number, but at least we got some RCTs available, which is considered to be a good quality evidence. And when you look at the 90-day mortality, the odds ratio is usually 0.72. So that kind of clearly says in favor of neuromuscular blockade agents. So if you that kind of explains why guidelines are saying that we should use neuromuscular blockade agents early in the course of ARDS patients, especially when in the severe ARDS patient when the PF ratio is kind of less than 150. And that kind of reflected in the practice that we kind of observed in the decade of 2010 to 2020, where people were kind of whenever a patient becomes a bit more hypoxic, PF ratio drops to 100, 150, people were kind of started neuromuscular blockade infusion, and that was kind of prevalent across the globe, not just one particular continent. But this trial has challenged this dogma. And everybody probably aware of this trial, which was published in 2019 in New England Journal of Medicine, and famously known as the Rhodes trial, came from the Petal Network Group, which is the National Heart Lung Institute group. And this trial was really a landmark trial, because not only this challenged the dogma of our practices, but also if now the guidelines come back in next year or two, when they consider this trial in the mix of all the previous available evidence, they might be changing the recommendation. Now, this trial was actually quite large. This actually included 1,006 patients, which is actually quite more than the previous available evidence. The 90-day mortality was quoted between 2 groups. One group obviously received neuromuscular blockade agent as an infusion for 48 hours versus other group was just standard routine care of ARDS patient, and the mortality was no different. Strikingly, as you can see, even in 21st century, despite all advances, the mortality of ARDS still remains high, around 42%. And what was the conclusion of the trial? So among the patients with moderate to severe ARDS who were treated with strategy involving high PEEP, there was no significant difference in mortality at 90 days between patients who received an early and continuous cis-atracurium infusion and those who were treated with the usual care approach with lighter sedation targets. And that kind of, it's very important, because what this trial has done is obviously it's basically challenged the dogmatic practice. So what it's saying is to us is, do not go in intensive care unit and start putting every single patient with a PF ratio of less than 150 on neuromuscular blockade infusions. That's not a good practice, because that's not going to change the outcomes of all patients. And it's important because, as I mentioned before, the first key takeaway message for me is every patient in ICU is unique. Even every ARDS patient in ICU is unique. That is different. And it's kind of obviously this trial has got limitations. So when you interpret even this trial and go on saying that we shouldn't use neuromuscular blockade agents at all in patients with ARDS, you really need to understand the limitations of Rose trial. The first limitation was this was an unblinded trial, and that means that obviously the trial was quite prone or subject to a lot of significant bias. It also there were 655 patients who were excluded from this trial because they already received neuromuscular blockade agent before enrolling into the trial. Now, if you add those 655 patients in analysis, suddenly you might see the change in the result because that's a significant exclusion number there. As I mentioned before, the neuromuscular blockade monitoring was not used. So we really don't know whether the neuromuscular blockade agent was used excessively, how they monitor the adequacy of the depth of the blockade. There is no mention of it. There's no monitors used. So it's very difficult to interpret the evidence. Because sometimes if you use the excess of neuromuscular blockade agent, that might actually harm patient rather than actually benefit the patient. And this trial was actually stopped early for the futility, because at the interim analysis, they thought there is no benefit of continuing this trial, and they stopped early. So we clearly don't know if the trial would have continued further, that might have changed the results. And surprisingly, and the most important criticism of this trial compared to the Accuracies trial, which was the landmark trial in 2020 done by Papazian and his group, which kind of clearly demonstrated the benefit of using neuromuscular blockade agents in ARDS patient and showed that mortality benefit with using neuromuscular blockade agent. In Accuracies trial, 50% of the patients were prone, while compared to that, in Roth's trial, only 16% patients were prone. Despite such a strong available evidence on proning in ARDS, where after the PROSEVA trial, which we all know that 50% reduction in mortality just with the proning in ARDS, which is a quite striking reduction in mortality. In this trial, surprisingly, only 16% patients were prone, which doesn't kind of make sense, because patients were sick. They had a PF ratio of less than 150, and then they didn't get prone. And we, with the COVID, we all seen how much wonder proning does, to the extent that proning become the mandatory norm now in treatment of ARDS. So this trial comes with a significant limitation, and that's why I was mentioning about, if the quality of the evidence is not great, interpreting the evidence becomes very difficult. So if you just read the conclusion of this trial and you decide to change your practice, you might be doing disservice to some of your patients. So it's very important to, again, kind of contextualize your the pathology, the patient, and the intervention. And that's the kind of key message. Now, if you look at the LungSafe trial study, which was the kind of large study conducted across 50 countries to understand the epidemiology, pattern of care, and mortality of patients with ARDS. Now, this study was landmark for various reasons. It was conducted in 2016. It was a kind of point prevalence study, and it kind of showed us that the mortality of ARDS is still quite high. It still remains around 40 to 50%, which kind of confirmed with multiple randomized controlled trials so far now that the ARDS mortality still remains very high. Now, how does that obviously that means we are dealing with this beast of ARDS for a long period of time, almost more than 50 years now, and still we can't reduce the mortality of ARDS. We tried every single intervention, and every single intervention almost failed to show the mortality difference except proning and in ARDS. So how we should now tackle this topic of neuromuscular blockade agents in ARDS? And it kind of, I want to just kind of take back to the journey of ARDS when it kind of all started. So 1967, Ashbach defined ARDS. Obviously, that definition was very primitive. So we kind of came up with another definition in 1993, 94, which is famously known as AECC definition. And then the Berlin definition come in kind of 2012. Now, the problem in meantime, there's a lot of things happen in regards to the various intervention were tried, and various interventions were tried, including the proning, neuromuscular blockade, driving pressure use, and all those things. Now, one slide I wanted to show is this one. This is the trust the results from the LungSafe trial. So when the LungSafe tried to analyze what are we doing in currently with patient regards to patient with ARDS, the neuromuscular blockade usage in mild to moderate ARDS was around 21% of the patients receiving. But as you go to severe ARDS, almost 40% patients were receiving neuromuscular blockade agents. With regards to recruitment maneuvers, again in the severe ARDS patients, 33% patients were receiving recruitment maneuvers. And again, only 16% of the patients were getting proned in 2016 in patients with ARDS. So LungSafe again kind of confirmed what we found in Roth's trial, that somehow, despite having a strong available evidence that proning helps reducing mortality, somehow clinicians are hesitant to perform proning routinely in patients with severe ARDS. They are kind of okay to try recruitment maneuvers. They are okay to try neuromuscular blockade agents, but not in every patient, at least 1/3 of the patients. But they are not very kind of confident to do proning. And the reason I mentioned proning multiple times, because sometimes in order to prone patients, you really need to consider neuromuscular blockade agents, because without them, there's obviously the risk of patient ventilator dyssynchrony is quite high, chance of tubes and lines coming out are quite high. So you really need to kind of think about using neuromuscular blockade agents while you're proning. And if proning is used in conjunction with neuromuscular blockade, the results of the trial might have been completely different. And that's the kind of the reason I wanted to bring it to your attention. So where do we go from here in terms of the definition? We got definition, and the problem with the Berlin definition, that as we all know, is more of a physiologic or the clinical parameter based definition, which really doesn't kind of tease out the underlying pathophysiology of ARDS, because as I said, ARDS is a syndrome caused by multiple various diseases and etiology, and it doesn't. So we are trying to use or test one intervention, that is neuromuscular blockade in patients with severe ARDS, which can be due to various pathologies, and we're trying to see whether that will change the mortality or not. And I think that approach is probably fundamentally flawed approach, and that's why we are not seeing what we any benefit with that agent. And that kind of explains why the pathophysiology is different, and how we want to then restructure our whole thing. Now, if you look at the in terms of the what we got available in terms of the interventions from the spectrum of mild to moderate to severe ARDS. If you look at what we got available now is pretty much ECMO, high HFO, nitric oxide, neuromuscular blockade, and prone positioning. Now, we know from the Eolia trial, ECMO doesn't change the mortality. High flow oscillatory oxygen is out, because again, we showed with OSCILLATE trial that we do not have a mortality benefit with that. Inhaled nitric oxide, again, there's no any mortality benefit with using. Now, we are saying after the Roche trial, the neuromuscular blockade is out. So what we left with actually in ARDS patient is basically proning and using some high PEEP with low tidal volume ventilation, because every other strategy has been proven not to change the mortality. So that's the basic problem with now. And obviously, there is no mention of one strategy, which is the recruitment maneuver strategy. And that's kind of a problem, because okay. So the lung recruitment, the problem with the lung recruitment is it has been thrown us in a kind of this confusion. And the reason I mentioned in the context of neuromuscular blockade agent, because when we perform recruitment maneuvers, we really need to consider the use of neuromuscular blockade agents. And then this question comes, to be or not to be with regards to recruitment maneuvers. And the reason this confusion started is because after we have this study called as ART trial, which was published in JAMA in 2017, and which kind of it was a large multi-centered study published kind of conducted across 9 countries, 120 ICUs, 1,010 patients, and it really kind of tested whether the recruitment strategy versus the standard ARDS net strategy works in patient with ARDS with respect to 28-day mortality. And surprisingly, there was actually the recruitment maneuver supposes like this showed to cause more harm than benefit. And then obviously the conclusion was these findings do not support the routine use of recruitment maneuver. And obviously, if you're not going to perform the recruitment maneuver, you kind of really don't need neuromuscular blockade agents routinely in kind of patients with ARDS. Now, again, even this trial had a fundamental flaws, and that's why the conclusions cannot be relied upon with regards to whether to do recruitment maneuver or not. The reason I say that, because if you understand really what recruitment is trying to do, and then what we should be doing is actually we shouldn't be achieving the recruitment is a one good thing, but at the same time preventing the de-recruitment is the main thing, and that's the key aspect of maintaining that recruitment and not allowing the de-recruitment. And the way the recruitment was conducted in our trial had a lot of issues. The trial design was changed halfway through the trial, and also it actually probably caused more harm to the patient than actually benefit. And in order to understand the ARDS and neuromuscular blockade in ARDS, you really need to understand the concept of individualized medicine or the personalized medicine, because the whole idea of try to put every single patient with ARDS in the one basket and kind of put one intervention and see whether the magic works or not. But all ARDS patients are not same. There are, again, different class categories within the ARDS patient, and broadly I kind of categorize them. Either the patients are recruiters or non-recruiters. Are they going to benefit from recruitment, or they're not going to benefit from recruitment? And that's really important, because if you're trying to apply the recruitment maneuver to the patients who are non-recruiters, obviously you're going to cause more harm and you're going to cause more increase the mortality. But if you're going to apply the recruitment maneuver to the patients who are recruiters, then obviously there will be a benefit. And that's why you need to choose your patients carefully before you kind of consider any intervention, including neuromuscular blockade agents. And the way the analogy it works is it's like a glass of a beer, as demonstrated on the picture. Basically, the more the foam, more that means patient is more recruitable, and the less is the fluid. More the fluid component or the edema component, either on the CT scan, that means that patient is not going to be more like recruitable, and applying the more recruitment is probably going to harm. And I think that's if you understand that, then obviously you will choose your intervention correctly, and that means the patient will not get harmed. Similarly, with the neuromuscular blockade, if the patient is non-recruiter, and I will not apply recruitment, and that means I will not give neuromuscular blockade agent in that patient. So another important concept to understand within the ARDS is the phenotype. And the great work done by Caroline Calfee and her group in the United States about identifying the phenotypes within ARDS based on the latent class analysis. And really it kind of separated ARDS into two main phenotypes. And the one phenotype to look for is the phenotype 2, which kind of comes with basically severe inflammation, shock, metabolic acidosis, and obviously it's going to be associated with the worst clinical outcomes. So if you identify this phenotype, that's probably this phenotype will probably not respond to most of the interventions. And that's probably why what we see in most of the studies, randomized controlled trial, why the ARDS mortality is high is probably because what we are seeing is the phenotype 2 is probably more prevalent, or the one which is 50% in that kind of population. That's where patients die with that particular phenotype. And no matter which intervention you apply to this phenotype is probably causing more harm, like because that phenotype has got inherent increased risk of mortality. And it's not difficult to identify this phenotype based on doing the simple investigations at the bedside, also looking at the clinical picture, and obviously that will probably obviously translate in the high mortality, but at least applying the intervention according to phenotype is important, because one size fits all again does not work with ARDS. And what is another important thing, what we seen the change of practices across the globe after we had this ARDS net landmark trial with low tidal volume and PEEP strategy. And although the initial ARDS net trial suggested to use kind of high PEEP, so if you're on FiO2 of 100%, you should be using 24 centimeter of water of PEEP. which is probably nobody uses at the moment in the clinical practice. But based on our beliefs, what happening is now across the globe, this is from the lung safe study data that shows that the average PEEP applied to patient, irrespective of their FiO2, is around 10 centimeter of water. So first of all, we are not following ARDS net table of PEEP. That means we probably don't believe in that table, or we are just too worried about applying a very high amount of PEEP because that will cause harm. And I agree with that. But at the same time, probably we are not applying the enough PEEP because PEEP of 10 centimeter water might not be enough for patient who is on 100% FiO2, especially the patient who is more of a recruiter of phenotype. So there is a fundamental problem that we are trying to apply the same amount of PEEP, whether the patient is on 30% FiO2 or 60% FiO2 or 100% FiO2, and trying to see whether that magic will work. And probably that's not the right way to look at the problem. And then the reason probably that happens because everybody is worried about this one magic number is plateau pressure. And everybody wants to keep the plateau pressure less than 30 centimeter of water. And that's predominantly we then kind of bring down the PEEP and then kind of try to maintain that plateau pressure less than 30. And again, if you want to keep the plateau pressure less than 30, make PEEP of 10. At PEEP of 10, I agree. Probably most of the patients will not need neuromuscular blockade agents. Just a deep sedation should be sufficient. But what we know so far is actually the plateau doesn't matter, because when the lung safe study looked at the correlation between the plateau and the mortality, there was no correlation between the plateau and mortality. So whether you maintain the plateau less than 30 or more than 30, there was no correlation between the mortality. What matters is actually the driving pressure. So as we understand the concept of driving pressure, which is the difference between the PEEP and the plateau pressure, that's your driving pressure. And the cutoff is usually used is a 7 centimeter of water. And if we have the driving pressure of more than 7 centimeter water, there is obviously 41% increased risk of mortality in that particular patient. So when it comes to what matters in terms of monitoring, the driving pressure is probably more important than the plateau pressure. So when I was asking the question about the neuromuscular blockade agent, how do you choose? A lot of people were saying, or 20% people said that I want to go with the plateau pressure, and 20% said I want to go with the driving pressure. But I think in between two, the driving pressure is probably the one to choose with or go with. Now, the reason the driving pressure is important because there is a significant correlation. So if you try to keep the PEEP same, but then you have increasing driving pressure over the period of time, that increases the mortality. If you keep the PEEP same or increase the PEEP, but you maintain the driving pressure same over the in different in different quartiles of the patients, then obviously the mortality remains the same. And interestingly, if you kind of increase the PEEP but decrease the driving pressure over the in patients, the mortality actually goes down. So PEEP and plateau don't matter too much. What matters is the driving pressure, and that's why monitoring driving pressure and adjusting your ventilator settings and then titrating even your paralysis to your driving pressure is probably the important. And again, that's probably how you should kind of work out any intervention effect. Okay, so driving pressure is the key. Now, the second important aspect of the ARDS that you need to understand in the context of neuromuscular blockade agents, that we are not just dealing with the lungs and chest wall, but also we are dealing with the heart component. And out of the four chambers of the heart, RV is probably the most important in terms of contribution to its pathophysiology in ARDS and mortality. Because what we know so far is RV dysfunction actually is quite prevalent in patients with ARDS. It accounts for 20 to 50% patients with ARDS, and increased RV dysfunction leads to increased mortality, and that's very important. Now, we also know that hypoxia leads to hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction that increases the pulmonary vascular resistance and increases the RV afterload. Similarly, hypercapnia leads to increased calcium influx, hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, and it increases the RV afterload. And then obviously high PEEP will result in increased transpulmonary pressures, which will obviously affect the venous pressures and increase the RV afterload. Now, neuromuscular blockade agents can help to obviously decrease the transpulmonary pressures, and that's where the utility of neuromuscular blockade comes in terms of decreasing the RV dysfunction. And sometimes, and that's probably why if you see the patients with ARDS who are showing the signs or echo features of RV dysfunction, I think that's another cohort of patients that you might benefit from RV dysfunction. And in this beautiful paper by Anton Villebaron from France, which basically shows how, and he describes this as an acute cor pulmonale in patients with ARDS. And one of the few strategies to maintain or avoid RV dysfunction is actually to maintain the right ventricular protecting strategy, which basically includes keeping the PCO2 down, maintaining the PO ratio more than 150, driving pressure of less than 18. And if you want to achieve this, I think the neuromuscular blockade will definitely help. They obviously they are not the sole agent which will be responsible, but also they can be a complementary in order to protect your RV. So again, the use of neuromuscular blockade agent in the context of the patients with ARDS is important. And I just want to show one of the little experiment that I did in my ICU with a couple of years ago with the GE ventilators. Luckily, we got them. And one of the key feature with the GE ventilator that you can do is you can actually calculate the FRC in real time while you're doing the recruitment maneuvers. And you can see on the left-hand side, the patient I started with a PEEP of 8 and went up to the PEEP of 20. And in a kind of 5 steps. Okay, so that's what's my recruitment or mini recruitment, I call it as, or baby recruitment, I call it as. And what I was monitoring at the same time was I was calculating the FRC, I was calculating the PEEP, I was calculating the compliance. So obviously PEEP was one which was obviously I was controlling. So you can see the middle row is I went from 10 to kind of 14 to 16 to 18, and then 19. That was the maximum PEEP. So obviously the ventilator performed those steps for me, but I was obviously monitoring the FRC and compliance at the same time. Now, what is interesting is if you look at at PEEP of 14, the FRC improved, compliance improved, but after PEEP 14, your FRC continued to drop. Compliance also dropped, and then there was further increase in FRC to some extent, but then there was a decrease in compliance. So if you want to ask me what's the sweet spot here, probably the PEEP of 14 is my sweet spot. And that's what we need to consider, multiple measurements in order to assess what's the optimal PEEP for that patient. Now, other things that you can actually do at the bedside, you can calculate even more numbers in order to satisfy that you are doing the right thing. So you can actually calculate the PEEP volume, so which is basically nothing but the PEEP multiplied by compliance, which is equal to 1260 mils. You can calculate the driving pressure based on this, and which came back to, in this case, around 7.5. And you can actually calculate end expiratory lung volume. Sorry. Yeah, you can calculate actually strain, which is nothing but the tidal volume with PEEP volume divided by FRC, and you can calculate end expiratory lung volume. And the strain was less than 1, end expiratory lung volume was 4,500. Now, the importance of all these numbers is, again, with any other numbers in intensive care unit, we do not go by the absolute numbers, just looking at strain less than 1, I'm happy. No, you look at all numbers, but also you look at the trend. So if you are performing the recruitment maneuvers in the baby steps, and if you are monitoring the trend in these numbers, you can actually see whether the patient is going. Also, you can do the imaging, which I kind of did post recruitment with the chest X-ray, and you can see the significant improvement in the X-ray. Now, the reason this is important in the context of today's talk is because then you need to really consider using the neuromuscular blockade agent just for performing the recruitment manual, because you really need to optimize the conditions for the recruitment, and you really don't want the patient to be coughing while you're performing the recruitment and other things. So that's why the use of neuromuscular blockade is still indicated in patients with ARDS. Sometimes as a continuous infusion, but sometimes as a boluses based on in the context. So I use in this context, and my approach is to use the baby steps. And similarly with neuromuscular blockade, I use the baby doses or the small aliquots rather than putting everybody on the infusion for 48 hours. That approach is probably the again extreme approach, but using the neuromuscular blockade in the context for the right patient in the right amount is probably the way to go. And even with the recruitment, you can still perform despite our trial showed the harm. But what I want to kind of show is like you can use it in a baby step, start with, see whether his patient is recruited or not, patient is responding or not, and then kind of continue to perform more recruitment. So the kind of take-home message for patients with ARDS especially is that you need to really identify the phenotype. So with this phenotype 1, phenotype 2, recruiter versus non-recruiter, then assess the recruitability based on the CT scan, based on your clinical assessment of the patient, looking at the imaging, and then perform the baby staircase recruitment maneuvers or the baby challenges of the increasing increments of the PEEP. And then you can do some of the real-time monitoring, such as monitoring the driving pressure, stress, strain, index expiratory lung volume, if that facility is available at your place. Also make sure that you do perform the echo or ultrasound to look at the RV. And then importantly, you can use the neuromuscular blockade in the context of as indicated. Again, I'm not saying that every single ARDS patient should go on neuromuscular blockade agents, but you kind of select your patients correctly, and then you can choose neuromuscular blockade agents. And that is what I call as personalized care in patients with ARDS. So I'm sorry I took a bit of a longer route to address your question whether we should use neuromuscular blockade agents in ARDS, but I thought this is a really, really controversial topic, and I need to do justice by providing all the available evidence and literature to support my own practice. So moving on to the next indication, it's status asthmaticus. Again, the status asthmaticus, if you look at from the pathophysiology point of view, is quite different to ARDS. So ARDS fundamentally is a problem with the lung compliance, while status asthmaticus is a problem with the lung resistance. And they're two different problems. Oxygenation is usually never been an issue in status asthmaticus, but usually the CO2 clearance is a problem. But obviously there are not too many studies available on this topic. So obviously routine administration of neuromuscular blockade agent is not indicated. I completely agree with that. Usually you start all of the bronchodilator management strategies, and in meantime you can use neuromuscular blockade agent just to facilitate ventilation as a short-term measure. Again, this data which is based on a very retrospective observational studies. There is no randomized trial here, and in 90-day mortality, there are only 1.6% patient died with the status asthmaticus. And it's very hard to perform any randomized controlled trial on this topic because you usually don't see that many status asthmaticus patients in ICU. But again, it's a very sensible like kind of sentence in the guidelines, which kind of I think it's very useful. If obviously in the life-threatening situations where obviously your deep sedation is not enough to manage the patient, either hypoxemia, dynamic hyperinflation, or a patient is obviously developing tension pneumothorax, you don't have choice, then obviously the survival is more important. In that case, the neuromuscular blockade benefit outweighs the harm, and you should be using it. In terms of the RAISE ICP, again, the problem is we do not have enough evidence, and again, routine use of neuromuscular blockade agent in patients with is not indicated. Usually the way I practice is usually the deep sedation analgesia is usually my first choice. Only if the ICP is persistently high and we are transferring the patient for urgent CT scan, or we are just waiting for neurosurgeons to come and kind of decide about decompressive cranectomy. In meantime, I might consider neuromuscular blocking agent as a paralysis. But again, routine continuous infusion is not usually the standard practice. In terms of therapeutic hypothermia or after out of hospital cardiac arrest patient, usually again there is no role for routine use of neuromuscular blockade agents, and again there is insufficient evidence on this topic. What we can do is again, if the patient is really struggling with the shivering despite large doses of sedation and analgesia, then 1 or 2 doses of short duration of neuromuscular blockade agent might be warranted. Now, raised IAP or intra-abdominal pressure is slightly different, and it can be actually useful in the setting of mild to moderate or sometimes even severe intra-abdominal hypertension in order to kind of stabilize things and decrease the abdominal muscle tone while you are kind of treating the underlying pathology. So neuromuscular blockade agent can be considered. That there is no absolute contraindication for their use in situations with abdominal catastrophe. But also what we need to understand is what are the complications associated with neuromuscular blockade agents. And the key complications to be mindful of is, first and foremost, is ICU acquired weakness that can be classified as critical illness polymyopathy, polyneuropathy, or polymyoneuropathy. And that's one of the bigger problems or bigger complication or concern that we have as intensivists while we use neuromuscular blockade agent as an infusion for the prolonged period of time. Because that means patient is not going to get off the ventilator quickly, will end up in getting the tracheostomy, and then will end up in getting the critical illness polymyopathy, and that's very challenging. So you want to minimize the duration of paralysis to start with, and also try to use the short-acting agents compared to long-acting agents. Unintended awareness and recall is another important problem. So that means patients who are requiring neuromuscular blockade agents must actually get adequate analgesia and sedation in addition to neuromuscular blockade agent. And often, how do you assess the depth of sedation while patient is on heavy dose of sedation is very challenging in intensive care setting. There is a lot of literature around whether we should use BIS, EEG. Unfortunately, there is not enough evidence to suggest or recommend routine use of BIS or EEG in ICU settings. And unfortunately, usually it's a clinical kind of examination that usually kind of suggested that that's one of your best guess guide, I guess, in terms of your choice of sedation and analgesia. Accidental extubation can be very problematic because obviously patient is all paralyzed, so you don't want to avoid that. And then there is an increased risk of venous thromboembolism with use of because patients are not moving their legs or lower limbs. There's also increased risk of corneal ulcerations and infections. So eye care is important, and that's why one of the strongest recommendations from the guidelines around eye care, because there's enough evidence on that. And then the slowed GI motility. So a lot of people do develop constipation, and that kind of can be challenging to address. Pressure injuries is a very common problem, and now it's one of the KPIs in Australia and New Zealand that we got to monitor very closely and take it very seriously here. So frequent turning of patients, even when they are paralyzed, is important. And then good nursing care is really, really vital. Yeah, so these are the kind of complications that you want to be aware of. In terms of the good practice, so obviously you want to minimize those complications by good housekeeping in ICU, which basically include good physiotherapy, maintaining the good analgesia and sedation to prevent the recall. You want to consider the DVT prophylaxis, maintain the adequate nutrition, and control the and then you want to kind of maintain the euglycemic control, good eye care, maintain the adequate nutrition, DVT prophylaxis as mentioned before, and then the good pressure injury care plan. And also important is the bowel management plan. So that's the kind of standard care. Where to go from here? So what we should be doing as a take-home message, first and foremost, one size doesn't fit all. So that means we shouldn't be discarding use of neuromuscular blockade agents in all patients. At the same time, we shouldn't be using as a blanket therapy in all patients. As I said before, the key take-home message, ICU is all about the balance above within risk and benefits, and we should be cautious about using neuromuscular blockade. And you need to understand the context in which you are using the neuromuscular blockade agents. And every patient in ICU is unique, it's different, and what I call it is, again, is as a personalized care or personalized approach with regards to neuromuscular blockade use. And what we should be doing in terms of choose your patient correctly, and sorry. So identify your right patient, assess the risk versus benefit, minimize the dose and duration, implement some real-time monitoring so that you can get a gauge of whether you're adequately or dosing neuromuscular blockade agent adequately or not, and make sure that you have a good ICU housekeeping in terms of your fast hugs. And that's what I call it as a personalized approach of using neuromuscular blockade agents in intensive care units. Thank you very much.